Hi Wales, and welcome to the last physics session on specified pracs as a part of the Carlam Cymru e-sgol programme. Today we're going to be looking at some of the specified pracs in your Year 11 course. Crucially, you will not have a Year 11 prac exam as other year groups would have had in the past. So Unit 7 will not be assessed this year. However, it does very clearly state that you may be asked questions about the specified pracs that you'll have completed throughout the year. So it's imperative that we have a look at those and make sure that you understand some key features of investigations in science in general. This isn't just for physics really, although the practicals we will be talking about are physics related. We will be talking more generically about science and scientific principles. So let's crack on and get into it. So today we will be looking at the terminology of scientific investigation. We're going to be looking at investigating terminal velocity, investigating Hooke's law, and investigating half-life. Those are the three specified practicals on your Year 11 course this year. So let's jump straight into the terminology now. There's a lot of scientific terminology that you need to be aware of when we are conducting investigations. I am not going to spend a huge amount of time on all of it, because if I was to try and cover all of it, then I think we would certainly run out of time. It might not be an effective use on it of that time. So what I intend to do in this session is make sure we focus on the ones that pop up the most in past paper questions. There are 2 pages of this, these terms as well, so I'll give you a chance to have a look at those. The slideshow is uploaded onto the Carlam Cymru website, so you can look at these at your leisure and look at these terms in a bit more detail at your own pace. Anyway, jumping straight in. To begin with, and to talk about variables, I'm going to start off by doing an example of an experiment and some data that we collected that you might have already done. And what we're going to look at are things like control variables. We're going to look at independent variables, what anomalous results are, but we're going to do it with a practical that you should really be familiar with already, hopefully. So this is the speed of water waves specified practical. And if you click on the link at the top up here, if you click on this link up here, when you see the slideshow on the website, that will take you to a video explaining the practical in a bit more detail. But essentially, you have a tray with some water in it. You lift up one end of the tray and then gently put it back down on the surface of the desk. That creates a water wave that goes from one side of the desk, so one side of the tray, sorry, back to the other side of the tray. And then you are measuring how long it takes to go 3 lengths of that tray. From that measurement of time, how long it takes to go 3 lengths of the tray, you're able to determine the speed of the water waves. Then, if you recall, you change the depth. So you add more water, and in adding more water to the tray, increasing the depth of the water, which you can see here, you are essentially then seeing how that affects the speed of the wave, which we see here. So variables. Now, in every investigation, you should be aware that we have both independent and dependent variables, okay? Now, independent variables are any variable that you change in an investigation. They're the one that you control, they're the one that you alter. So in this particular example, the independent variable, okay, the one you change would be the depth of the water, like we mentioned, okay? So that is the independent variable. Now, the dependent variable is always the one that you measure, okay? And that, in this case, is the speed of the water waves. I mean, you would be actually working out the time first and then using that to calculate the speed. But you have to remember that you could be asked here what the dependent and independent variables are on a given investigation. So I've got this table now. You can see there that the first column is the independent variable, and in fact, as a general rule, the first column will always be the independent variable. So if you're a bit stuck and you're a bit unsure as to which one's which, if you at least remember that in any table, the first column is nearly always the independent variable, then you won't go far wrong. And then the other variables being measured is the dependent. Control variables then. Okay, so in an investigation, any investigation, you have to consider control variables. And these are variables that have to be kept the same in order to get reliable results. In the case of the waterway practical, I mean, there's a couple we can consider. So, for example, if I just go back to this image here, one thing might be to drop it from the same height each time, or as near enough the same height as each time. You might also decide that to have a fair test, you would use the same tray throughout. Okay. Another one might be that you would consider having the tray on a level surface. Okay, so if the table was at a bit of a slant or a bit of an angle, then you might not get a fair and consistent result. So level surface, same height, and so on. So your control variables are anything you can think of that you need to keep the same throughout the investigation so that your results are reliable. Next definition then. Resolution. Now, resolution is a question that might pop up in a GCSE exam paper. A question may ask you to state the resolution of a particular piece of measuring equipment. Now, here we've got a thermometer, and if you think about a thermometer and the thermometers that you might have used in school, you'll know that the smallest measurement that you can make with those thermometers is 1 degree Celsius. All right, 1 degree Celsius. So therefore the resolution would be 1 degree Celsius. However, up here, look, we've got a digital thermometer. And if you can see on your screen there, that digital thermometer, which would probably be used to measure a person's temperature, is actually measuring 36.2 degrees. Now, if we think about the resolution of that measuring instrument, then we've got to think about what the smallest measurement that could be made with that thermometer might be. And that thermometer could read 36.2, but equally it could have read 36.3, 0.4, and so on. So the smallest measurement we can make there is 0.1 degrees Celsius. So the resolution for, they both measure in temperature, but they have different measure resolutions on those pieces of measuring equipment. Now here you've got a weigh-in scales, okay, and the weigh-in scales, although we can't see the resolution very clear in there, it could be the smallest measurement might be 1 gram on a kitchen scales. On the scales that we use in school, it is 0.01 on one of our sets of balances, 0.01 grams. It's more sensitive, got a smaller resolution. So that's what we mean by the term resolution. Anomalous results. Now, whenever we're doing a practical, we always try, of course, and collect accurate data. However, often through human error or maybe systematic error, maybe some sort of fault with the equipment that we're using, we could end up with some anomalous results. And they are results that are much bigger or maybe much smaller than others in a data set. Another way of saying this would be that they don't follow the trend in the results or the pattern in the results. More on that in just a moment. But if we actually look at our data table down the bottom here, I just ask you for a moment to look to see if you can find an anomalous result. Can you see an anomalous result in that table? Something that doesn't fit the pattern or the trend, or something that's much bigger or smaller than other data in that set. Now, if you've had a chance to pause the video maybe and have a little look, what you might have found is, after studying it, that in fact this here is an anomalous result. You can see that compared to the other two measurements in that data set of 7 and 7.4, you can see that this 5.4 is significantly lower. All right, and therefore there was probably a mistake made in measuring for that result. Okay, in addition to that, you can actually not just look horizontally at other pieces of data in the set, but you can actually look at this vertically as well. Now, what you'll see here, if you look vertically, is that the trend is that the speed of the waves increases. Okay, so we start off at 5.5 and then we go up to 6.5. Now here's our anomalous result. Look, it goes down, look, to 5.4 before returning back up to 8.8. So that's another way of sort of spotting an anomalous result. Now, if you spot an anomalous result, very often a good piece of practice, a good practice is to just circle that anomalous result and acknowledge that and even label it. All right. Calculating the mean. Now, calculating the mean, you will have done in mathematics before, and you will, I'm sure, have done it in science as well. And the reason why we will test something multiple times in science is so that we can reduce the effect of random errors. If we take multiple measurements of the same thing, then we can become more and more confident of that accuracy if we then take those results and calculate an average or a mean. All right, so you already know, I'm sure, how to calculate a mean. All right, and to calculate a mean, you have to add up, all right, all of the data for the 3 tests. So in this case, look, you'll be adding up 5.5 for this first value here, plus 5.7 plus 5.4. Now, very importantly, I'm going to press equals at that point. All right, so let me just pop that in my calculator. 5.5 plus 5.7 plus 5.4, okay, equals 16.6. I'm going to write down my 16.6 here, and then we're going to divide that by the number of values that we have, right, which in this case is 3. So we divide that by 3, and that gives us a total, gives us a mean of 5.53. Now, in science, we shouldn't go to more decimal places than the data that we've got, so we would just leave that as 5.5. Right. Very importantly as well, what you've got to be mindful of is that you can get this calculation wrong, because if you do 5.5 plus 5.7 plus 5.4 and then type divided by 3, then this might well come out as the wrong answer. Okay, that might well come out as the wrong answer. It's so important that you work out that total first of 16.6, and once you've got your total, then divide by 3, because what happens here, the calculator may well just divide this last number here, this 5.4, divides that by 3, and then adds on these other 2 values, and that would be bad. Okay, yeah, you got it. Sad face. So that's how you calculate a mean. But we're not done. We're not done, because what about that anomalous result? I hear you say, Mr. Red, what about that anomalous result? Because when we have an anomalous result, we are basically saying that we don't think that that result is correct. We don't think it's reliable. We don't believe that it's true and accurate. So we had our anomalous result here of 5.4. If we circle that in the table, we've got 2 options. Let's see. Number 1 is to retest. Right, so test again. Okay, so we could run test number 1 again and get another result to replace that. Or option 2, which is more likely really, we ignore result. when we calculate our mean. So in that scenario, if we were calculating this mean here, what we do now is we'd ignore the 5.4, we do 7.0 plus 7.4. Now we'd be dividing by 2. Okay, but we work out our total first, so that's going to be 14.4 divided by 2. 14.4 divided by 2 is 7.2. Sorry, excuse me. Divided by 2 is equal to 7.2. Right, have 7.2 there. Right. That's how you handle an anomalous result. Precision and reliability. Two terms that pop up a lot. So what we've got now are two data sets. Okay, we've got Tom's results and we've got Malvina's results. And I know that seems like a little bit of an odd name, but that was my nan's name, right? So be nice. Anyway, precision is how close a set of measurements are to the mean value. So here, look, I've calculated these means, okay, as we started doing the previous part. And the precision then is how close the set of measurements are to the mean value. So you can see here, test 1, test 2, test 3, they're pretty close to the mean value. I mean, test 2, look, I mean, it does deviate ever so slightly from the mean, okay. This one here does deviate a little bit more from the mean by 0.2. This set here, look, these are all very close to the mean, aren't they? And then, well, we ignored this one before. There's a bit of deviation here from the mean, 0.2 either way, and so on. So you get the gist. Repeatability then, okay, repeatability, and I should put a little arrow for these actually, shouldn't I, so we can see which ones we're talking about. So that's precision. And then at repeatability, which is this one, that is the precision obtained when repeat readings are obtained. So when we have 3 results which are all very similar, then we'd say that the repeatability is very good. So for example, here 8.8, 8.7, 8.7. Here we've got 3 results which are all quite precise. So we'd say that they're very repeatable. All right, they're very repeatable. Whereas with this set of results just here that we started off with this set of results here, because they deviate considerably, right, from 5 up to 5.5, we would say here that the repeatability of that set of results is not very good. And we can even have a look at the repeatability of the investigation as a whole. So if we look at the 2 students who completed this investigation, we can sort of ask a question of whose results were most repeatable. And if you look at those 2 data sets, the persons whose results were most repeatable, have a little look, see what you think. Persons whose results were most repeatable, I agree, are Tom's, okay? So Tom's results are the most repeatable because they tend to be a little bit closer to the mean value, all right? And you can actually show the spread here is only 0.2 difference, so that is only 0.2 higher than that. This one here, oh, that's only 0.1 different to the mean. Look, this spread here results, well, they go from as high as 7.4 down to 7, so there's a fair difference there, isn't there? These are pretty good, mind. And these are quite good. And then with this set of results, you can see that they are pretty well, they scattered a bit more between 9.4 and 9. We've got 8.5 and 9, but 8.9 there, so that's a difference of 0.4. We've got 7.8 and 7, so that's a rather large difference there. So because the results are less consistent, Malvina's results are less repeatable. Reproducibility. Now, reproducibility, a measurement is reproducible if different learners/groups obtain the same or similar results. Now, even though we said that maybe Tom was a little bit more accurate in how he took his measurements because his results were a little bit more repeatable because they were all a lot closer together, we can make a comment on the reproducibility, which is something different. It's a similar kind of word, but it's different. And what that refers to is if another group does the experiment, did they get similar outcomes? If they followed the same method, used the same equipment, for example, did they discover similar outcomes and results? And to look at that, we can look at the mean on both, all right? And you can see here you've got 5.5 and 5.3, 6.5, same on both, 7.2, 7.3, 8.7. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the reproducibility is very good. It tells us that the results are reproducible because two different groups obtain very similar values. So that is what we mean by reproducibility. So terminology. Some of the most important terminology now I'm going to say we've covered, and we're going to give that a tick. Now we're going to look at some specifics, okay? So to begin with, we're going to look at the terminal velocity practical. Now, depending on where you are in the course for physics, you may or may not have done some of this theory behind the practical work, but I'm just going to take us through that quickly now, okay? So with terminal velocity, a good way of understanding what is meant by the concept is to consider a skydiver. Now, when a skydiver jumps out of a plane, there is only one force acting on him, okay? That is his weight. Due to Newton's second law, if the forces are unbalanced, then an object will accelerate in the direction of that unbalanced force. So in this situation, there's only one force acting on him, that's his weight downwards. The forces certainly are unbalanced, so that means he also accelerates downwards as well, right? He speeds up. But as he speeds up, right, the air resistance is 0, so he accelerates downwards, okay? Accelerates downwards. But as he speeds up, this force starts to come into play, okay? His air resistance, okay, will start to increase because air resistance depends on, as does friction, depends on how fast you're moving. And the faster you move through a fluid, or the faster you move across a surface, the greater the air resistance or friction will be. So as he moves faster, the air resistance gets larger, and what that will mean is that the resultant force, or the forces, are starting to balance out until, okay, his speed will become so great that the air resistance is big enough to equal, okay, the skydiver's weight. At this point, the forces are balanced, so his speed becomes constant. Oh, I'm sorry, I was supposed to say constant, okay? His speed becomes constant. This is called terminal velocity. So this practical that we're going to look at now is all about terminal velocity. It's all about the investigation of when the force of weight is equal to the force of drag, okay, or drag or air resistance, okay? So we're all looking at when W equals D. How fast is this force? How does it change with weight? And that's what the following investigation is about. So you may or may not have done this. Terminal speed of a falling object. Now the method to completing this practical is written on the left hand side there. I'm not going to talk through the method now. Again, like before, I think for those of you who are really keen and want to do really well, go back and go through this slideshow slowly and read the method. You may have already done the practical in school. Having a very good idea of what that method is important. So in this investigation, you drop K cases, right, from above the ruler. You let them fall actually from like up here, right? And they speed up, and very quickly they reach what we call terminal velocity. And then from a set distance, you measure how long it takes for the K cases to fall through that known distance. So that distance might be 1.5 meters. You measure how long it takes to fall through a distance of 1.5 meters. And from that, because as you know, speed equals distance over time, if you know the distance is equal to 1.5 meters and you've just recorded the time, then you can work out the velocity of those cake cases, actually the terminal velocity of those cake cases. That's basically the experiment. Then you change the number of cake cases in this, okay? You change the number of cake cases, and in doing so, you're changing the mass. So in a investigation, you might be asked simply to look at how the number of cake cases varies, or how it affects the terminal velocity, or you may be asked how the mass affects the terminal velocity, but you stack the cake cases on each other like so to increase the mass. So in this investigation, what is the independent variable? That's the thing that you change. So if you were asked that question, you'd know that it's the number of cake cases or the mass. So if you were asked to measure the mass, then you could add, obviously, you'd have a weighing scales, a balance, and you'd measure the total mass of all the cake cases. The dependent variable here is the time to fall 1.5 meters, sorry. And from that, we can determine the speed. So the speed or the time to fall would be our dependent variable. That's the thing we measure in investigation. And then finally, what control variables would there be for this? If you're asked that in an exam, same person timing, we all have slightly different reaction times. So having a consistency with the same person timing is very important. The same height to drop each time. Okay, if someone doesn't drop from exactly maybe 20 centimeters above the 1.5 meters, then we might not have reached terminal velocity by the time the timer starts. Same type of cake cases. If you're just counting cake cases, then if you were to use different brands as you went through and you weren't using the same cake cases all the way through, then that could affect the mass, and it could affect the way in which they fall. And finally, a straight ruler. That's one's often overlooked, so making sure that your ruler is dead straight, so that you it's straight and vertical, so that you're getting an accurate measurement of the distance as well. So these are some things that we need to consider as control variables. So here's a question then, okay, on this practical from a recent paper that the students sat. A class carries out an investigation into the relationship between the terminal speed of paper cake cases and their mass. They let the cake cases drop from about 20 centimeters, right? That's a bit of important information, above the pointer, which is 1.5 meters above the floor. They time how long they take to drop from the pointer to the floor. Assume that after 20 centimeters, the cake cases will be traveling at terminal speed, right? Which is really what we just discussed, right? So there's a nice diagram of that. Now, the students take some trial readings to help them determine the number of repeat readings they need to take. Here are the results for one cake case. So you can see here now the students did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They did 8 trials. So obviously very determined to get an accurate result. Circle the anomalous result. That's the first question. So I'm going to give you a moment to have a look at that. Which result doesn't fit the others in the data set? Now we can't look at the trend in the data set because we've only got one cake case here. All right. So we can only look at one of these compared to the others in that data set, and you should have quite accurately spotted it as the 0.72. It is significantly lower than the others measured. Okay, so that's our 1 mark club just for knowing that. Hey, calculate the mean time. Right, now the mean time, what do we need to do here? Well, we need to do 1.16 plus 1.19 plus 1.17 plus 1.29. Remember, we ignore the anomalous result, okay? Plus 1.22 plus 1.24 plus 1.15 equals, sorry, I just got to punch that in there, 1.16 plus 1.19 plus 1.17 1.29 plus 1.22 plus 1.24 plus 1.15 equals. So this all comes to 8.42, and remember the importance of writing down the total first. Divided by how many? 8? Are we dividing by 8? Are we? Are we? I hope you're not happy with that, because we don't divide by 8, because now look, 8 trials including the anomalous result. So now we're going to divide by 7. So we divide by 7, and that equals 1.202, but we can only put down same number of decimal places, so it's 1.20. And then calculate the mean speed. Well, the mean speed, well, let's think about the information we got here, right? This is more of a mathematical skill question rather than a practically based question or an investigative skills question, but we've got the time it takes for them to fall 1.5 meters. So this is the time we've determined. So we can use that equation, speed equals distance over time. So V is equal to distance over time, and the distance is 1.5 given to us at the top of the table, divided by 1.2. All right. 1.5, I know this 1.25 is there. 1.5 divided by 1.2 is 1.25. And very often you might be asked to calculate, one of these values in a table, and it's just good practice to know how to do that. What's the independent variable in the experiment? I wonder if you can remember that. So the independent variable in this experiment was the number of cake cases. Number of cake cases. And then state one control variable in this experiment. Well, we did this previously, didn't we? So it would be maybe the drop height would be one. But we mentioned others as well. Explain how the data could be measured more accurately. Now, with this practical, there is quite a considerable amount of human error, because timing this might get trickier as you add more cases, and the whole thing falls faster, and you've got this whole human reaction time issue. So one of the things you can do is you can, for example, use computers or some other digital techniques. So you could use light gates, which, if you don't know, are sensors that are hooked up to a data logger. So as they pass through these little laser beams, it starts and stops a stopwatch. So you could use light gates, or another one would be to video the drop and watch back in slow motion. Okay, that could be something that you could do as well. Anything that happens quickly, all right, that you want to measure, you could always video and then work out the time from that. So that's another thing to do, especially with some phones today. Well, not some phones, it sounds so old there. All phones really, okay, will have certain phones you got, because you've all got flashy phones, but they have high-speed cameras on them as well. So they record like 60 frames per second. So it's very easy to look at the exact moment when something was dropped and when something hit the ground. So there's a couple of techniques. So we're going to say investigate terminal velocity done. All right, and now we're going to move on to Hooke's law. Now Hooke's law is very straightforward practical. We look at how a spring, how its extension, and our extension is how it extends in this direction, how that is affected by the weight. So we look at how X changes when we increase the weight, or if you like, the force. The force is changed by the weight, okay? So let's just think about that for a second and answer these questions real simple. If we are changing the weight and measuring the extension, then our independent variable, what are we changing in the investigation? We're changing the force or the weight, measured in newtons. The dependent variable, what are we measuring? We're measuring the extension. And then finally, what are the control variables? Well, There are a couple we can think of, okay? I've listed them here. So, for example, making sure measurements are made at eye level. When you're looking, okay, at where maybe the masses are, the bottom of the masses, or the top of the spring is, maybe might be better, okay, the top of the spring here, where you're looking at the top of the spring and where it is in relation to the ruler. If you're looking up at an angle like this, then you might not be getting a very accurate result and a very accurate reading. So it's always important to take recordings and readings like this, right, as close as you can from eye level, so that everything's lined up nicely and you're not getting you're not making mistakes there. Measure from the same point each time, so you can't start off by measuring from the bottom of the masses and then take a measurement from the top of the spring and then take a measurement from the bottom of the hook. All right, that's going to be a total disaster. Making sure that the masses are still when measuring X. Now, one of the things that this whole thing does is it will have a tendency to bob up and down a bit because it's on a spring, isn't it? So it'll bob up and down. And what you have to do is make sure that that's still, okay, when you're taking your measurements and your readings. Again, the method is here. Have a look at it prior to any assessments or examination that you're having, just in case that you're quizzed on any particular part of it. But we've just really been through that. Important thing to remember that extension X is the change in length, all right, is the change in L. It's not L. The extension is how much L, the length of the spring, increases by. Very important distinction. So you might get a graph such as this to analyze and look at. One thing that often pops up on Hooke's law is determining the spring constant. Now, to determine the spring constant K, we look for a formula. F is equal to Kx. That is in your formula booklet. Now, K, you need to determine the spring constant, is equal to F over X. So what we've got to do here is have a look at a value of F. Let's say I take 1.5 here, a nice big triangle. I come across here, and that is going to be 6.4. Let's see, that's 7, 8, 7.8, 7.6, 7.4. So what we'd have here then is a force of 1.5 newtons over 7.4. That, oh, let's see, 1.5 divided by 7.4 equals 0.2. Okay, 0.2 newtons per centimeter, and that would be the unit of measurement as well. Newtons, look, per centimeter. Your units will be on the graph, so make sure that you don't write down newtons per meter. In this case, it's newtons per centimeter because we're working in newtons and centimeters. So that's Hooke's law investigation done. Half-life. Now, quickly, what do we mean by half-life? Some of you may not have got this far in your physics course, and you may not have got to radioactivity yet. So I'm going to give you a summary. I'm going to give you a really quick version of radioactivity and half-life. So some atoms are radioactive. They are unstable. This is the nucleus of an atom. The nucleus is the part in the center of the atom that contains the protons and the neutrons, as you already know. Some of these are really unstable, usually because they've got an imbalance in the number of protons and neutrons. When you get this imbalance, they're really unhappy, and when they're really unhappy, they'll either emit alpha, beta, or gamma radiation. All right, and that is what we call radioactive decay. Now, the thing is with radioactive decay, it's a random process. All right. This guy here, who you all recognize, I'm sure, he hated this. It really bothered him. You can see he's got a sad face on there. And the reason he hated it is because you cannot predict which one of these nuclei will decay first. I don't know if you got it. It turned out to be that one. It's a bit like popcorn in the sense that when you microwave popcorn, if you've ever done that, you put the popcorn in the microwave and it starts to pop. You can't predict which one of those kernels is going to pop first. All right, which corn is going to pop first. All right, it's a random process. So half-life then what I want you to do now is imagine, right, that all of these dots here, they're all individual radioactive nuclei. So that's a whole nuclei, that's a whole nuclei, that's a whole nuclei. And we've got a big lump here of radioactive atoms, all right? That's what we've got here. The half-life is the time it will take, right, for half of a radioactive sample to decay. So here we've got a radioactive sample, half of them, time taken for half of them to decay will be 1 half-life. So if we begin with 16, after 1 half-life, which is a certain amount of time, it varies depending on the radioisotope, it depends on the element that we're actually using, the source that we have. There will be 8 remaining after 1 half-life. After 2 half-lives, it goes down by half again. Then there will be 4 remaining, 12 will have decayed. And then finally, after 3 half-lives, we will have only 2 remaining, 14 will have decayed. You can plot this in a graph, and this is the same sort of thing, but with popcorn. We go from 16 to 8 after 1 half-life, to 4 after 2 half-lives, to 2, and so on. And we end up with what we call an exponential decay curve. All right. So when you do this investigation, you will model it using dice. So here are my students who kindly agreed to a photograph, you know, for all of you, keenly working on this experiment. And the way this is done is by taking these dice, which represent the random nature of decay, because one of the sides of those dice is coloured black. When you throw the dice and it lands with the black face up, then that means that the dice has decayed. That means that, you know, it's the equivalent of a radioactive isotope having emitted its radiation and decayed. So what happens is we are able to model, which is sort of like replicate what goes on in nature by using these dice. And if we have a large number of dice to begin with and we throw them, what we'll see is that although we can't predict which ones are going to decay, we can have some clue about how many will decay. So that's the method. Again, take a little look at that. Okay. And here are some examples of the decay dice. Now, some of them, look, these are cool decay dice here. And they've got more sides to them. Okay. And as such, they are less likely to decay every time we throw. But of course, these ones have got a 1 in 6 chance of decaying every time we throw. So the independent variable here then is the number of throws. So you throw the dice, you put to one side the ones that decayed, they are gone, and then you pick up the remaining and you do it again. All right. The dependent variable then is the number of dice remaining that haven't decayed, and they represent the number of radioactive isotopes that you've got left. The control variables then, making sure the dice are shaken properly and thrown. There aren't a great deal of control variables for this investigation really, other than just being vigilant and careful. They're difficult to think of, but you have to make sure that you properly throw the dice, of course, so you know that every one of them's been turned or had the chance to randomly decay. And this is a really effective way of modeling how radioactive samples decay in nature. So initially, a lot will decay. So when you when you throw those dice, you will get a large number decay, and you can see that on the graph there. So after one throw, okay, we went from 100 down to whatever it is, like 83. Okay, so we had quite a number decaying. Then the next jump then went down to 79. But as we lose dice and as we lose radioactive isotopes, the rate at which they decay starts to decrease. So how steep this is, this line, tells us about the rate of decay. And as the line gets shallower and as it gets less steep, then the rate of decay goes down. Now, in an exam, you might well be asked to determine something like the half-life, how long it takes for half the sample to decay. To do that, you have got to look at how many half is. In this case, is 50, quite conveniently, because we started with 100. And that, look, takes about 2, that's 3. That's about 3, yeah, about 3 throws, okay? So that's about 3 throws. So that's how long it takes for one half-life, in this case, 3 throws. Now, in nature, that would be time, all right? So that might be 3 years, 3 minutes, whatever it might be, okay? Now, 2 half-lives, look, the time it takes to go down by half again half now would be 25. You can see here it's closer to 7. So it's relatively consistent. So every time we go up through one complete half-life, that should correspond to the number of dice going down by half again. So it goes down from 50 to 25, from 25 to roughly 12, from 12 to 6, from 6 to 3, and so on and so forth until it starts to tail off at the end there. All right. Now here's a question from a previous past paper question. From past paper rather, sorry. So we got a set of class results here, and we got a simple question: give one reason why the bigger sample size makes the data more repeatable. Okay, and what you need to know here, and this answer will help you always, is more data. Okay, more data. Okay, less will mean, okay, means that the effect, sorry, the effect of random errors are reduced. Okay, so more data means that the effect of random errors are reduced. Okay, and that is it. There are some other bits on the slideshow and some other questions about control variables, about calculating means, and anomalous results. And I urge you to have a look at that if you're really keen to make sure that you have, you know, good practical, good investigative skills and a good understanding of how science is investigated. But for now, we'll leave it there, I think, unless there are any questions, of course, Mr. Nettle in the chat.
Nope, there's no questions at the end.
All right, thank you very much then, and goodbye.